A single candle flickered in the cold stone chamber. Its light stretched across the rough walls, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of the tower. Outside, the guards' footsteps echoed quietly in the halls. Every sound reminded her that time was slipping away. Anne Boleyn sat alone at a small wooden table. Her hands were steady, her mind focused. Before her lay a piece of paper and a quill. On that paper, she would write what history remembers as her final letter. But history may have misunderstood it. Anne dipped her quill into the ink and paused. The candlelight caught her pale face, highlighting the strength in her eyes and the fear that lingered just beneath. She knew that tomorrow she would be gone. The king she once loved, the man who had turned England upside down to be with her, would see her no more. In the crown, the titles, the power, all stripped away by rumors, jealousy, and the cold calculations of those around him. Yet here she sat, quietly, deliberately writing. It is tempting to think she wrote to Henry out of fear, a woman pleading for her life. But her words were different, calm, controlled, measured. Not a single line betrayed desperation. Anne was clever. She knew that everything she wrote would be read not only by Henry but by ministers, courtiers, and spies. Every word could be twisted, every emotion dissected. She could not afford a mistake. Not now. She paused again, letting the quill hover above the page. Outside the window, the night was still. The wind carried the faint cry of a distant owl. Inside, the tower was quiet, as if the stones themselves were listening. Anne's mind wandered for a moment to all that she had lost. Her freedom, her friends, the love she once believed Henry had truly felt. And yet, deeper than sorrow, there was a strange calmness, a clarity. This letter would not be written for herself. Not truly. Anne had loved deeply. She had risked everything for Henry VIII. She had changed the course of a kingdom. He had called her his most beloved, his cherished queen. And yet, when she failed to give him a son quickly enough, the same love curdled into suspicion. Betrayal whispered through the halls. Friends she thought loyal betrayed her. Servants she trusted testified against her. Even the ministers who had once bowed before her were now agents of her downfall. And still, she wrote. The quill scratched softly across the paper. The words she chose were precise. And she praised Henry as a good king. She accepted the fate that had been forced upon her. She did not cry out, she did not curse, and yet hidden between the lines there was something else, something protective, something deliberate. Anne knew the power of words. She knew they could save or destroy. And this letter, written on the edge of death, may not have been for the king at all. Perhaps it was for her daughter, Elizabeth. The thought of Elizabeth gave Anne a measure of peace. The little girl had been born in secret, a daughter of scandal and whispers, yet Anne loved her fiercely, more fiercely than anyone could ever imagine. She had endured shame, loss, and the cold judgment of a kingdom to secure Elizabeth's place. And now, even in her final hours, she acted with the same care. Every word in her letter could be a shield. A shield to protect her child from Henry's wrath, from the court's cruelty, from the full weight of a father's anger. The candle flickered again, threatening to die. Anne reached out, steadying it with a hand that did not tremble. She wrote with intention. She wrote with purpose. Every phrase was chosen to calm, to appease, to hide truth while revealing grace. The letter looked like forgiveness. It sounded like love. But the truth was deeper, subtler. It was a mother's protection. Anne remembered her own mother's warnings. Be strong and think before you speak, Lady Boleyn had said. Anne had taken that lesson to heart. She had survived courts, rivals, and whispers of treachery. She had survived Henry's temper and the cruelty of others, and now, in this final act, she survived in her words, not for herself, but for Elizabeth. Outside, the wind shifted. A distant owl called again. Anne paused, looking at the dark sky beyond the narrow window. London slept. The tower held its breath. She could almost imagine Elizabeth years from now reading this letter, or knowing that her mother had been clever enough to protect her with words she would never see. That thought brought Anne a strange comfort, and yet the question lingered. Would Henry understand? Could he see past the calm, the obedience, the measured grace? Or would he read only what he wanted to see? The loyal, forgiving wife? Perhaps he would, perhaps he would not, but that no longer mattered. The purpose of this letter was not to save Anne Boleyn. The purpose was to save Elizabeth, to keep her future safe from the anger, suspicion, and cruelty of a king who could not love without judgment. Anne leaned back in her chair. The candle had burned low. Shadows danced across the walls. She read her words once more. Graceful, careful, protective. A letter that would survive, a letter that could shield a child from the full force of history's cruelty. A mother's quiet act of courage, hidden beneath the surface of obedience and calm. As the night deepened, Anne set the quill down. The letter was finished. She folded it slowly, deliberately, sealing it as if sealing a promise. Not a promise of love, but a promise of protection. Tomorrow the executioners would come. Tomorrow the tower would echo with footsteps and steel. But tonight Anne Boleyn had controlled one small piece of her destiny. One act of love that could not be taken from her, and in that quiet chamber Anne closed her eyes for a moment, her letting the silence wash over her. The tower was still, the candle guttered. She had written her last words, words that history would read as forgiveness, words that may have been intended for someone else entirely, words that held the weight of a mother's heart. The night passed slowly. Anne could hear the soft breathing of the guards outside her door. She felt the cold stone beneath her hands, the chill of the tower in her bones. And yet, she felt something warmer, something stronger, the certainty that her daughter would survive, that her child might someday rise above scandal, above sorrow, above the mistakes of men. History tells us she wrote to Henry, that it was a letter of loyalty, but the truth may have been more profound. Anne Boleyn, facing death, wrote not to a king, but to a daughter she loved fiercely. Or a daughter she would never see fully grown, a daughter whose future she was protecting, even from beyond the grave. And so, in the Tower of London, one candle flickered and died. A quill rested on a table, a letter waited to be read. And Anne Boleyn, brave, clever, and quietly heroic, prepared to meet history on her own terms. Not as a wife betrayed, but as a mother who had understood finally how to use her last words to protect life, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. The Tower of London had never felt colder. Its stone walls held more than echoes, they held judgment, suspicion, and the weight of a kingdom's anger. Anne Boleyn walked its narrow corridors, her skirts brushing the floor, her mind tracing every shadow, every whisper. She had once walked these halls as queen, adorned in silks and jewels, to commanding attention with every step. Now she was a prisoner, stripped of power, stripped of allies, stripped of hope. The fall had been swift but not sudden. Rumors had spread like wildfire through court. Henry's love, once fiery and unyielding, had cooled. It began with questions about her ability to produce a son. Then came whispers of improper conduct. Friends turned away. Courtiers who once bowed now avoided her gaze. Even those who claimed loyalty spoke in half-words and secret glances. The air around Anne grew heavier every day, thick with accusation and betrayal, yet she did not crumble. Anne moved quietly through the tower, her hands folded, her back straight. There was no crying, no begging. The woman who had once commanded armies of influence now commanded herself, and still the world around her whispered. See, friends testified against her, men she had trusted spoke lies, and Henry, her husband, watched it all unfold. It was as if every moment of her life had been a thread, and now those threads were being pulled apart, unraveling in silence. The irony was cruel. Henry VIII had declared her his most beloved. He had defied the Pope, changed the Church, and overturned centuries of tradition for her. He had crowned her queen. And now, that same man would sign her death warrant, accusing her of crimes she did not commit. Betrayal, Anne thought, is a cold and silent thing. It can hide in a smile, in a nod, in a promise, and it had surrounded her completely. At night, Anne sat by the window, looking at the dark streets below. London slept. She thought of Elizabeth, small and fragile, unaware of the storm gathering above her head. A mother's heart can break quietly. Anne's did not scream. It beat steadily, with purpose, with strategy. She understood something the world around her did not. Survival, sometimes, was not about saving yourself. Sometimes it was about saving someone else. Anne did not speak her fear aloud. She could not. Every word could be twisted, every expression observed, and so she acted with precision. She dressed carefully, she walked with dignity, she spoke politely to the guards. Every gesture, every word was measured. Even her letters were carefully composed. They were not cries for mercy, they were shields, armor crafted from ink and paper. Yet inside, the storm raged. Her mind wandered to the court that had once worshipped her. She remembered the laughter in the halls, the music, the promise of power. She remembered Henry's touch, his attention, his fiery words of love. How quickly it all changed. The same court that had raised her up now conspired to bring her down. The men who had sworn loyalty now testified against her. Even the ministers she trusted now whispered her death. And still, Anne faced it with calm. She had to, for Elizabeth. Anne thought of Jane Seymour, waiting quietly in the wings, Henry's next queen, the woman who would take her place. History might remember Jane's gentleness, her obedience, but Anne remembered the fear, the calculations, the small betrayals. She understood the machinery of power, the danger of love in a palace built on ambition and envy. She had seen it all, and she had survived, even if only in her mind and in her pen. The guards brought her food, but she hardly ate. The candle on her table burned low. The shadows stretched across the walls like fingers. She sat at the small desk, quill in hand, thinking of Elizabeth. She did not write to beg, she did not write to curse, she wrote to protect. Every phrase in her letters, every sentence was carefully constructed. Anne understood that words, like actions, could save or destroy. And now, her words would be her final act of power. Outside, the night was still. A dog barked in the distance. The wind rattled the window panes. Anne closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The silence was complete, broken only by the slow drip of water somewhere in the tower. This silence, this cold, this loneliness. It was her companion now. But even in this isolation, Anne's mind raced. She thought of Henry's anger, the accusations, the rumors. She thought of friends who had betrayed her, allies who had abandoned her. And she thought of her daughter, Elizabeth, whose future she must protect, even from the father who had condemned her. The court would remember Anne Boleyn as a traitor, a fallen queen, a woman who had dared to rise too high. But Anne remembered herself differently. She remembered her strength, her intelligence, her courage. And in these final hours, she wielded that courage carefully. She would not allow her anger to be her undoing. She would not allow her grief to define her. Instead, she would channel it into her letters, into her actions, into the small ways she could still influence the world beyond the tower walls. She wrote another line, paused, and studied it. The words were precise, graceful, protective. They were meant to calm, to shield, to ensure that Elizabeth would have a future, and that her child would survive the storm that was coming. Anne's pen moved like a sword, each stroke deliberate, each pause meaningful. History would call it forgiveness. History would say it was loyalty, but Anne knew the truth. It was love. Fierce, protective, unyielding love. And then she stopped. The candle had burned almost entirely down. Its flame flickered weakly, threatening to die. Anne leaned back in her chair, letting the shadows play across her face. She thought of Elizabeth, asleep somewhere, innocent and unaware. The thought of her daughter's safety brought a measure of peace. Even as the tower closed in around her, even as betrayal and accusation pressed from all sides, Anne Boleyn found a quiet strength. She had lost a crown, a husband, a future, but she still had her words, and through them she could still protect life. Hope and love. History will tell us Anne Boleyn was a queen brought low. History will say she was accused of crimes she did not commit. But history cannot fully capture what it means to write a final letter with a child's future in mind, to face death with calm and dignity, to wield courage quietly, invisibly, with ink and intention. This was Anne's secret, this was her true power, and it was not for Henry, it was for Elizabeth. The night stretched on, the wind shifted again. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Anne placed her quill down, folded the letter carefully, and sealed it. One small act, one final gesture of strength, love, and protection. She had survived, at least in spirit. Her daughter's future was now, at least in part, secure. And though the world around her would soon forget the details, the quiet heroism of this night would ripple through history in ways even Henry could not foresee. Anne Boleyn walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping city. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. Tomorrow would come. Tomorrow would bring her final act in the tower, but tonight, in this quiet room, she had exerted the last measure of her control. She had loved, she had protected, she had survived in the way that mattered most, and as the candle guttered and died, the Tower of London held only silence. A single queen, facing the weight of betrayal, love, and history, had written words that might outlive even kings. The morning sun had yet to touch the tower walls. The air was heavy, damp, and quiet, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. Anne Boleyn sat at her small desk, the flicker of a candle still casting shadows across her pale face. She read the letter she had written once more, carefully, slowly. Each word seemed alive, carrying the weight of a kingdom, of betrayal, and of a daughter's future. It was graceful, polite, accepting. On the surface, it looked like the letter of a loyal, obedient wife, a queen who forgave her king and bowed to fate. But Anne Boleyn was no ordinary queen. She was clever, sharp, a woman who understood the power of words better than anyone in England. She knew that her ink could protect or destroy, that a phrase, a pause, a carefully placed compliment could shield a life from ruin. And that was exactly what she intended. History remembers Anne's final letter as a declaration of loyalty. Yet the careful reader, the one who knows the subtleties of power and love, it might notice something else. The letter is not just about Henry. It is not about pleasing a king. It is about protecting someone who cannot protect themselves. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was only a child, a little girl living in a world ruled by men and whispers. One misstep, one accusation, one angry word from Henry could have condemned her, labeling her illegitimate, stripping her of every chance at a future. Anne could not allow that. Even as death loomed over her, she wrote for Elizabeth, not for Henry. Every line, every measured phrase was an attempt to hide anger, fear, and injustice from the eyes of those who could harm her child. The letter begins with calmness, almost serenity. Anne calls Henry a good king. She does not curse him, she does not plead. She accepts her fate, but in her acceptance lies intention. She masks a mother's desperation with a wife's grace. Those who would read the letter, ministers, guards, spies, would see loyalty, but those who could read between the lines might feel something more: quiet defiance, intelligence, strategy, and love. Anne had always understood that survival in the Tudor court was not about brute force, it was about subtlety. Every word spoken, every gesture, every smile was a tool, a weapon, or a shield. And now, facing execution, she wielded her pen with the same precision she had wielded her influence. Her letter was her final act of courage, written not to save herself, but to save her daughter. She leaned back in her chair, thinking of Elizabeth's tiny hands, Elizabeth's bright eyes. Her daughter would grow up in a world that might not understand her mother, a world that might call her illegitimate, unworthy, or a product of scandal. But Anne's words could protect her, even from afar. That thought brought a strange comfort, a kind of quiet triumph amidst despair. Death was coming, yes, but Elizabeth might live, thrive, and rise. The quill scratched again across the paper. Anne's mind wandered to Henry. He had loved her once, fiercely, obsessively, but love in the court of kings was never simple. It was political, dangerous, and fleeting. Henry's heart had changed, his desire cooled by disappointment, by ambition, by the need for an heir. He no longer saw Anne as a queen, a partner, or a mother. He saw only failure, a threat, a distraction. And yet Anne did not write to accuse him. She did not write to lament her betrayal. That would have been fatal not only for herself but for Elizabeth. But instead, she wrote words that calmed, soothed, and protected, words that could keep a little girl's future intact. Every now and then Anne paused. She pressed the quill into the ink, thinking of what could happen tomorrow. Executioners waiting, crowds gathering, Henry observing, the weight of a kingdom pressing down. She thought of how quickly loyalty turns to betrayal, how whispers become law, how love turns to suspicion. And in that pause, she made a decision. Her words would shield Elizabeth from all of it. Anne's thoughts drifted to the court, to the men who had betrayed her. They would read this letter, but they would not see the real message hidden beneath the words. They would believe in her obedience, they would believe in her loyalty, but the truth, the mother's truth, lay hidden. Elizabeth's life depended on subtlety, on deception, on love disguised as compliance. Anne had mastered all these arts, and she wielded them one last time. Her letter was not a plea, it was not a confession, it was a carefully constructed shield. She could forgive Henry, but she did not. She could accept her fate, but she did not. Every line was calculated to protect, every sentence meant to preserve what the world might try to take away. Anne folded the letter slowly, her hands steady. She sealed it with wax, her mother's crest pressed into it. A queen without crown, a mother without safety, had produced one final act of power. Not with armies, not with jewels, not with influence, but with ink and intention. The candle flickered, casting shadows across her face. Anne looked up at the window, seeing the dark city below. She imagined Elizabeth growing up strong, intelligent, unafraid. Perhaps Elizabeth would read this letter someday. Perhaps she would understand. Perhaps she would know that even in death, her mother had protected her, loved her, and prepared her for the life she deserved. Anne's calmness remained. The tower seemed less oppressive in that moment. She had wielded one last weapon, words. Words that could outlive death, outlast betrayal, and outshine even the cruelty of a king. History records Anne Boleyn's execution. It remembers accusations, charges, and scandal, but it often misses the quiet heroism of that last night. The bravery not in defiance, not in accusation, but in protection. The courage of a mother writing a letter designed to shield her child from harm. The sun began to rise, pale light slipping through the tower's narrow windows. Anne placed the quill down one final time, her letter complete. Every careful word, every subtle phrase would now live on, carrying the weight of love, sacrifice, and cunning. Her final act of courage had been completed, not to save herself, but to save Elizabeth. And in that quiet early morning, with shadows retreating before the day, Anne Boleyn sat alone. Death awaited, betrayal surrounded her. The king she once adored would soon pass judgment. And yet, through her words, her daughter's life had a chance to thrive. That was the truth hidden between the lines, the secret Anne carried to her final hours. Not a letter to a king, but a shield for a child. Even as the tower prepared for the horrors of the day, Anne Boleyn smiled faintly. History might remember the crime, the betrayal, the execution, but for her, the quiet triumph of this letter would always matter most. She had faced the worst of humanity and emerged in one way victorious. One pen, one letter, one mother's love. And in that act, Anne Boleyn's power lived on quietly, invisibly, and profoundly. The morning of silence. The first light of May 19th, 1536, crept slowly through the Tower of London, a gray, misty dawn that seemed to soften the harsh stone walls, yet could not soften what was about to happen. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, now walked calmly toward the scaffold. Her steps were measured, her posture straight. There was no falter in her step. No tears betrayed her fear. She wore a plain gray gown, simple yet regal, a queen without her crown but not without her dignity. The crowd had gathered, whispers passing through the air like the wind. Many came to watch the end of a woman they had once admired, envied, or feared. Some whispered about her crimes, others spoke of treason, adultery, and witchcraft, but Anne Boleyn did not see them. She could not. Her focus was elsewhere. She walked not as a woman defeated, but as a mother who had completed her final duty. The letter she had written the night before rested in careful secrecy. Its words would reach eyes that mattered, even if the king never understood their true meaning. In those lines, she had hidden love, sacrifice, and hope. She had forgone anger and accusation to preserve the life of her daughter. Elizabeth would live, she would grow strong, she would rise, and Anne had played her part invisibly, brilliantly, in ensuring it. Anne reached the scaffold. She looked at the executioner, a man whose duty was as grim as it was necessary. His eyes met hers briefly, and she gave no fear. She spoke calmly to the guards, her words measured. She did not plead, she did not cry. In that moment, she was a queen once again, not of crowns or kingdoms, but of courage, dignity, and strategy. She controlled the one thing she could still control, herself. The crowd murmured. Some were sympathetic, some were cruel. But Anne's calmness commanded attention. She spoke a few words to the onlookers, quietly asserting her innocence, yet never condemning the king. It was a delicate balance. Every gesture was precise, every movement intentional, every breath calculated. It was, in a sense, the final act of her clever life. Her words, her demeanor, her courage, all orchestrated to protect her daughter Elizabeth. The queen who had once been accused, betrayed, and abandoned now used death itself as a shield. The axe glinted in the morning light. Anne knelt. She placed her head upon the block, unshaking, serene. The crowd gasped. A murmur ran through the onlookers, but she faced the moment with dignity. In her calm, there was a lesson. Power does not always belong to kings or crowns. Sometimes it belongs to quiet courage, to a mother's love, to words that survive beyond death. Anne Boleyn's life had been filled with grandeur, ambition, and love, and betrayal. But in her final act, she transcended all of it. She ensured that Elizabeth would survive the whispers of court, the cruelty of men, and the weight of history. The little girl, born of scandal and fear, would one day rise to become one of England's greatest rulers. And Anne's letter, her silent, careful strategy, had helped make that possible. Even as the axe fell and history recorded her death, Anne's spirit remained. Not as a victim, not as a traitor, but as a mother, a queen, and a strategist who had played her final move perfectly. History would remember the scandal, the trial, the execution, but it would not always remember the quiet heroism of that last night, the courage hidden in ink, the love disguised as loyalty. The tower returned to its silence. The morning mist lingered, and somewhere beyond the walls Elizabeth slept, unaware of the danger her mother had navigated to protect her. She would grow to inherit not just the throne, but the legacy of a woman who understood that sometimes survival requires more than bravery. It requires wisdom, patience, and a fierce love that can bend even the cruelty of kings. Anne Boleyn had lost her crown, she had lost her life, but she had preserved what mattered most, her daughter's future. Elizabeth would inherit a kingdom, yes, but more importantly, she would inherit the promise that her mother had fought for, the promise that a life of courage, intelligence, and love could withstand the worst the world could offer. And in that promise, Anne's power lived on, quiet, invisible, profound. The tower held only silence now, but Anne's presence lingered. In the shadows, in the stone walls, in the whispered stories of court, her courage survived. History would tell of her execution. History would speak of her trials and accusations. But her real legacy, the secret protection of her daughter, the strategic brilliance of her final letter, and the humanity that endured in her final hours, would echo quietly through time. Anne Boleyn's life ended that morning, but her story did not. Not fully. Not for those who read between the lines, who understand the subtle acts of love and courage that history sometimes forgets. The mother's bravery, the quiet heroism, the final act of protection, these are what endure. These are what make her story truly human, truly unforgettable. And so, as the sun rose higher, casting its pale light on the Tower of London, the memory of Anne Boleyn remained. Not as a queen betrayed, not as a scandal of the court, but as a woman who loved fiercely, acted wisely, and faced death with grace. Her letter, her words, her courage, invisible shields against the cruelty of men, would outlive her, and her daughter, Elizabeth. She would rise to rule in England, shaped in part by her mother's quiet, indelible genius. Anne Boleyn had walked calmly to the scaffold, but she left behind more than sorrow and scandal. She left behind a story of love, strategy, and survival, a story written in ink, shadow, and courage. And through it, the echoes of her humanity would continue to touch the hearts of those willing to see beyond the surface, to read between the lines and to witness the true depth of a mother's love.